All right, welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Thrilled to be with you today for the virtual reading group. We are trying something new, as we know, in the last few weeks. Instead of reading simply one book of Hannah Arendt's, as we've done for about 8 years, we're reading a series of her writings around a particular topic, in this case, the topic of race. And one thing that, I'll just ask is, as we go forward, I will go back to reading books as well, but I'd love to hear from people as we go forward about whether you like this idea of thematic readings, and maybe we intersperse these in with books over time and see how it goes. In any case, we spent the last 2 weeks reading the 2 chapters from her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, about race. I mean, there's actually a lot more about race in that book, but we focused on those 2 chapters, Race Thinking Before Racism and Race and Bureaucracy. These are chapters she wrote in the late 1940s, published in 1950, and were very much concerned within her thinking about totalitarianism, about anti-Semitism and racism as an ideology. One of the things that is central to her thinking is her claim that there's a difference between anti-Semitism in the sense of hatred of Jews or dislike of Jews, and anti-Semitism in the sense of an ideology that the Jews are the cause of the problems of the world and need to be expelled or killed. And this distinction she makes between anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism, between Jew hatred and the ideology of anti-Semitism, is one that comes back throughout her writings in different form. So on Violence, which we'll read in a few weeks, she's going to make a distinction again between racism and race. And race is going to play the sort of the idea of race thinking, which she's going to distinguish from racism. We are reading today a long fragment, very long, which was supposed to be a book. She wrote it as a book, which was going to be her second book after the Origins, or third if you can count the Varnhagen book. And she never finished it. She worked on it in the mid 1950s, and then put it aside and instead wrote and published The Human Condition. Yana and I were just talking before everyone came on. I mean, this is one of both of our favorite texts of Arendt's in many ways. It's an extraordinary text, and it has many different aspects to it about politics. That's what it's called. It's Introduction to Politics, and so much of it goes to her thinking that will end up in The Human Condition and elsewhere. We're reading it, excuse me, we're reading it today for a slightly different reason, which is that in the, excuse me, which is that in this text, she, in explicating the idea of politics, makes the argument that there is a deep-seated prejudice against politics. And I think if those of you who know her work will be able to understand this pretty well, right? Plato, as you know, saw Socrates killed by his compatriots, or not killed, he committed suicide, but he was ordered to be killed by his compatriots because he was accused of corrupting the youth and challenging the old gods. And Plato, in Arendt's reading, interprets this as the dangers of politics, right? The dangers of letting doxa, or the hoi polloi, the many, govern. And Plato, in his Republic, seeks to develop an idea of truth as a limit to politics, philosophy as telling us how to live in a way that is more true than what the many can arrive at. And so Plato's Politics expunges politics in the sense of opinion and contest and plurality from the world. And this ancient prejudice against politics, that politics will kill independent thinkers like Socrates, that politics will lead to danger because politics will lead to demagogues, that politics will lead to war insofar as the people will be inflamed in their passions and have proclivities to elect people who will be warlike, that in an age of nuclear bombs, politics could lead to world destruction. We rebel against politics, Arendt says, and we want to be governed by elites or experts or those who we trust to even out the dangers of the multitudes and the masses, and that this long-standing anti-political attitude, this prejudice against politics, is very much at the core of so much of Arendt's thinking in the 1950s and beyond. And so she explores this prejudice, and in doing so, talks a lot about prejudice. And in talking about prejudice, right, she's going to normalize prejudice, right? She's going to say that prejudice is part of our political world, right? Because what is politics? That's how she begins this chapter on page 93 in the book, The Promise of Politics, edited by Jerome Cohn. And she begins with this section, what is politics? And she says, politics is based on the fact of human plurality, right? That's, of course, something very familiar to those of you who've read The Human Condition and other works. God created man, but men are a human earthly product. We are men. And politics deals with the coexistence and association of different men. Man, she says, is apolitical. But politics is political insofar as it happens between men. It's the space in which men come together. And so it's in this in-between space where we organize unique and different men and try and have them live together in some sort of common world of relative equality. So this is on page 96, where at the end of section 1, she says, God's creation of the plurality of men is embodied in the absolute difference of all men from one another, which is greater than the relative difference among peoples, nations, or races. I mean, it's an extraordinary statement, and I just ask you to actually take a moment and read it and think about it. The absolute difference of all men from one another. I mean, this is something that is deep in Hannah Arendt, and I think very much counter to many of our contemporary instincts. And I think that's what she's writing about. In fact, what I would say is our instincts, right, are against politics and thus against plurality. Right? That's what she wants to say. Insofar as politics is about radical absolute difference and thus plurality, you know, that's scary to us. And anyone who's living in the world today sort of knows that. I mean, I mean, everyone's talking today about how the polarization of the world. I mean, the actual difference of what people want today is actually pretty minor. I mean, we're not living in an age of radically different ideologies, right? I mean, most people want to live in a fairly stable, semi-capitalist welfare state, with certain stability. And yet we talk about massive polarization. There have been many eras in the world where the differences in opinions are much greater than they are today about how to live. And yet we are terrified of these differences. We're terrified of polarization. We're terrified of politics. And so Arendt talks about this absolute difference. We are all different. We want different things, and that's not bad. For her, that's good. That's part of what it means to be man, to be human. But in that case, she says, in the case, she says that God's creation of the plurality of men is greater than the relative difference among nations or races. But in that case, there is, in fact, no role for politics. From the very start, politics organizes those who are absolutely different with a view to their relative equality, right? So even though we're absolutely different, what is it that we share? And in the common world, how do we, in spite of and amidst our differences, come together and form a collective? And so that's the beginning of this essay, Introduction into Politics, which now becomes, and the first part is what is politics? And now the second part is prejudice against politics and what, in fact, is politics today. And again, I've sort of already intimated at this, but the prejudice against politics is that politics is dangerous, that politics will lead to war, and especially today, nuclear war. If people really are different, and if we accept that difference and we let that difference become governing amongst people, well, it may turn out that there's irreconcilable differences and we have to go to war, and that's quite dangerous. There's a second aspect of this prejudice against politics, which is that, well, what do we want instead of politics? We want, she says on page 97, a world government with a vast administrative machine. We want bureaucratic rule because bureaucracy will stabilize things, will put experts in charge, and will prevent the kind of dangers and entropy that politics can lead to. Okay, so now we said, what is politics? It's plurality. What is the prejudice against politics? Well, we want to avoid too much plurality, and we want actually central administration and bureaucracy, which she is very skeptical of. And then we come to this section beginning on page 99, called Prejudice and Judgment, right? And you might think, okay, why? And why are we going to go now so deeply into prejudice and judgment? And it's because prejudice, something many of us have a prejudice against, right? There is a deep prejudice against prejudice today. And part of what I'm suggesting that Arendt is here doing is saying that our prejudice against prejudice is part and parcel of our prejudice against politics. And just as she's trying to reconstitute or get us to understand the importance of politics, there's a way in which she's also trying to compel us, persuade us, provoke us to at least, if not abandon, rethink our prejudice against prejudice. So she begins and she says, the prejudices that we share, that we take to be self-evident, that we can toss out in conversations without any lengthy explanations, are, as already noted, themselves political in the broadest sense of the word. That is something that constitutes an integral part of those human affairs that are the context in which we go about our daily lives. The prejudices play such a large role in daily life, and therefore in politics, is not something we should bemoan as such, right? Prejudices are part of our lives, and let's not think that's bad. For that matter, we shouldn't attempt to change it. Man cannot live without prejudices. And not only because no human being's intelligence or insight would suffice to form an original judgment about everything, but also because such a total lack of prejudice would require superhuman alertness. Her point here is that we are prejudiced. To be plural is to be prejudiced. We all encounter the world from our perspective, as she says in other areas, from a doke moi, from the way I see the world, from my opinion as it presents itself to me. And none of us can make judgments all the time. It would require a kind of superhuman alertness. It's just not possible. If I walk down the street and I see someone carrying the human condition, and next to them I see someone carrying Harry Potter, I make judgments about them. Are they right? No, not always, right? But it's much more likely for me to go up to the person carrying the human condition and talk to them than the one carrying Harry Potter. Now, the one carrying Harry Potter may be a much more interesting person and a much more thoughtful person. But because of my prejudices, I'm going to miss out on that. And Arendt is saying that's just life. There's two stores, and one is chess and one is badminton. And I go into the chess store and talk to the chess people. I might have a life transformative experience if I went into the badminton store, but I'm not going to do it because of my prejudices. And that's okay. And that means not only about that, but it's, if I see, two people on the street and one is dressed in a way that I find appealing and one is dressed in a way I don't, same thing. And if I see one who looks like part of my tribe and someone who doesn't look like part of my tribe, well, I may be prejudiced to hang out with my tribe, or I may be prejudiced to hang out with people not in my tribe. But either way, I'm going to miss out on other people. And that's why she says prejudices are something we shouldn't bemoan. They're part of life. We can't get rid of them completely. Now, here's, I think, one of the key sentences. And I would actually argue that even though this is an unpublished work and not as widely read, this is one of the key sentences in all of Arendt's work, right here on 99 to 100. So I just want to point it out and focus on it. She says, that is why in all times and places, it is the task of politics to shed light upon and dispel prejudices, which is not to say that it is its task, that's namely the task of politics, to train people to be unprejudiced, or that those who work towards such enlightenment are themselves free of prejudice. Now, that is a sentence, right? Anyone who writes that sentence once in their life should be read for the rest of humanity. Let's just take the three parts of that sentence, as far as I understand them, and separate them out. The first is that on the assumption that all people are prejudiced and all people have prejudices, it is the task of politics to shed light upon and dispel prejudices. All right, that's one. What does that mean? Well, we're going to have to get into that, and we're going to have to read a little bit more about what prejudices are. But if prejudices are, and as she's going to say a little later, prejudgments, things that we take on authority, right? So I make a prejudgment that I like people who play chess, or I make a prejudgment that I like people who read the human condition, or I make a prejudgment that I like to hang out with other Jews, or I like to hang out with other blacks, or I like to hang out with other Muslims, right? I make those prejudgments, and they come from authority, and they're genuine prejudices, she'll say on 100, insofar as they don't claim to be judgments. I'm not saying I want to hang out with this person who's carrying the book, The Human Condition, because I've actually made a judgment about this person and I got to know them and I think they're someone I should talk to. They're based on prejudices, on prejudgments, based on criteria that may or may not be true. And so politics, which is the activity we said of of trying to live together in relative equality amongst our prejudices means that I have to learn to make judgments and free myself from my prejudices and try and encounter people as relative equals in the public sphere. That's at the essence of politics. And so you think, oh, okay, so she doesn't like prejudices. We have to get rid of prejudices. But then look at the next part of the line, right? Which is not to say its task is to train people to be unprejudiced. Because you can't train people to be unprejudiced. Every DEI and anti-prejudice workshop to the contrary. We are all prejudiced, and to try to train people to be unprejudiced would be a kind of brainwashing or totalitarianism or dehumanization. What would it mean to train someone to be unprejudiced? It's not possible. None of us can go through life without prejudices. So we have to dispel prejudices and shed light on them, but not train people to be unprejudiced. Well, what does that mean? Well, then look at the third part. And she says, it's also not to say that those who work towards such enlightenment, namely who work to dispel prejudices, are free of prejudice. That's the hammer, right? Those of us who think we want to dispel prejudices have a prejudice. What's our prejudice? Anti-prejudice. It is itself a prejudice in favor of politics, in favor of plurality. And it is a prejudice that cannot be fully realized because all people are prejudiced, including ourselves. And so we have to realize that our anti-prejudice work is itself in the service of our prejudice. Which doesn't mean we can't pursue our prejudice, which is to make the world more political and less subject to unthought prejudices. But these are all prejudices, and none of them are true. None of them are right. They are prejudices we have and that we engage in as part of politics. She then says the degree of alertness and open-mindedness in a given epoch determines its general physiognomy and the level of its political life, right? How open we are, determines an epoch. But an epoch in which people could not fall back on and trust their prejudices when judging and deciding about major areas of their lives is inconceivable. We can't imagine an era without prejudices. So the point here is that we all have prejudices. Prejudices come from authority. And in the social realm, she'll say on the bottom of 100, prejudices are common. You can't be a social person and not have prejudices. You have to decide if you're going to go to the chess club or the badminton club. You have to decide if you're going to hang out with people like yourself or people unlike yourself. You have to decide if you're going to, be a sports person or a classical music person or both, or however you're going to do it. And if you don't have these social prejudices, you can't be social, because to be social, you have to go into and be part of a social arena where you hang out with people like yourself. That said, there are dangers to prejudice, right? So on 101, she says one of the reasons for the power and danger of prejudices lies in the fact that something of the past is always hidden within them, right? I've liked chess in the past. I've liked Hannah Arendt in the past. I've liked hanging out with Jews in the past. I've liked hanging out with people unlike me in the past. And these become prejudgments that I now apply to people in the future. They evolve into a prejudice because they've been dragged through time and I don't examine them. I now take them for granted. And so she'll say in the middle of 101, the danger of prejudice lies in the very fact that it is always anchored in the past, so uncommonly well anchored that it not only anticipates and blocks judgment, but also makes both judgment and a genuine experience of the present impossible, right? When I have a prejudice, I make these prejudgments, and it makes it almost impossible for me to make a thoughtful judgment about someone or something, because I've already made my judgment in the past. And that's the danger, is that it causes us to not actually encounter reality, encounter the world in its fullness, because we are governed by our past judgment. And so then she says, if we want to dispel prejudices, right, and that's what she says is the activity of politics, we must first discover the past judgments contained within them, which is to say, we must reveal whatever truth lies within them, right? There's the rub. Every past judgment has a truth. When I decided I wanted to hang out with chess players or other Jews or other people of my race or people of different races, there was a truth in that. When I decided that Jews were greedy or Muslims are dangerous or whatever it is, there was some experience that led me to decide that in that particular case, but it's become a prejudgment, not a judgment. And so she says, because there's that truth in it, we have to reveal that truth. Why? Because if we neglect to do this, she says, whole battalions of enlightened orators and entire libraries of brochures will achieve nothing, right? As is made eminently clear by the truly endless and endlessly fruitless efforts to deal with issues burdened with ancient prejudices, such as the problem of the Jews or of Negroes in the United States. Simply telling people Jews are not greedy, right? Or blacks are not lazy, or whatever it is, or Muslims are not terrorists. It's not going to work. You can't do that. It won't help unless you engage and go back to the original judgments. And that is what she calls the activity of politics. Why? Because politics is what? It's talking and experiencing and living with people with whom you disagree. It's encountering the people you're prejudiced against in relative equality in the public sphere and talking to them in a way that you learn about them. And only in that way do you start to make judgments that maybe dispel your prejudices, your prejudgments. And that's the way she thinks about politics and prejudice. Now, I want to just point us towards another level of this. And I know I'm going a little longer than usual, but this is a complicated question, so I just want to make sure I get this. So on page 102, she will add, in every historical crisis, it is the prejudices that begin to crumble first and can no longer be relied on. What does she mean? Well, I mean, we could talk about a number of examples. I'll just give you two for now, right? We are living through a kind of historical crisis now around what is now called by many people the crisis of expertise. People are no longer believing experts. The prejudice against the people, the Platonic prejudice against politics, against plurality, against the masses, and that we should be governed by experts is breaking down insofar as people are increasingly less trustful of experts, of institutions. And so she says, in every historical crisis, the prejudices that begin to crumble first. And so there's the prejudices against people are now saying we should listen to people. And so things like sortition instead of assemblies and a revitalization of the idea of listening to the people is coming back. But, and she says, precisely within the non-binding context of people say and people think, within the limited context where prejudices are justified and used, they can no longer count upon being accepted. And so these prejudices against the people, which have ossified and turned into something else now become questionable. And we have to confront these prejudices in a more in a way of making judgments about them. And in doing that, the inherent legitimacy of the prejudices breaks down. And the people who have these prejudices get nervous because they used to know, I believe experts are good, people are bad. Now they can't just make those arguments. And so they begin to embellish them. She says, this is actually on page 152. I'm skipping 50 pages ahead of time, but it's an important connection. And in beginning to embellish them, they turn their prejudices into the perversion of theory, which we now call ideologies or worldviews. And she says the difference between a prejudice and an ideology is that a prejudice against the people is just a prejudgment where I don't really trust the people and I listen to experts. And it's just because I know it's true. I don't have to think too much about it. An ideology against the people is I think the people are deplorable. I think they're the hoi polloi. I think they are dangerous and they have to be controlled. And I begin to come up with arguments for the need to control the people. Saying that they shouldn't be allowed to vote unless they can pass a test or things like that. And as prejudices crumble amidst historical crises and the easy acceptance of prejudices becomes the conflict with reality, the danger is that people will turn these prejudices into ideologies that become dangerous. That's one example. Another example that I think we can see right now is the breakdown in prejudices in the last X number of years around sexuality. First around homosexuality and now around trans issues, right? There was a prejudice for many years that there were just two sexes and everything had to be there and heterosexuality was the norm. And you've seen a steady breakdown of that prejudice in our society over the last 50 or so years. And it's certainly exploding in the last 5 to 10 years, especially around trans issues. And what do you see happening? You see many people who had just relied on that prejudice and not thought that much about it, coming to turn that prejudice into a universalist ideology, which they want to legalize and defend in law and mobilize and weaponize in ways that are quite dangerous. And that's the danger that comes with the dispelling of prejudices. That doesn't mean we should stop the activity of politics, which is dispelling prejudices, but it means that we have to do so, I think, as Arendt's teaching us, in a way that doesn't simply preach against the prejudice, but seeks to engage in politics, which is talking to people, listening to them, and understanding that our prejudice, whether our prejudice is for experts or for the people, or whether our prejudice is for an open sexuality or for a closed sexuality, whichever side we're on, is also a prejudice. And therefore, what we're not doing is telling people, you have to sacrifice your prejudice to truth. What we're telling people is you have your prejudice and I have my prejudice, and we need to talk to each other in a way that we both learn to make new judgments, which will allow a new prejudice, a new common prejudice that we can share to emerge. And that's what I think Hannah Arendt means by politics. Talking to each other in a way that we not attack prejudices, but dispel prejudices in the name of creating new prejudices. Ones that are more open and more responsive to reality as it's evolved and emerging in the world. Okay, there's a lot there. There's obviously a lot more in this essay, and we've talked about this essay in other ways in previous sessions, but I'll stop there and again ask you to engage in one of two ways. One is through the chat. And again, please look, these are complicated issues. I've just basically told you we're all prejudiced. You know, you can attack me, fine. Attack the ideas. Don't attack the person. Please do engage in this in a respectful way. I think this is a very powerful essay, but I can understand that some people might be bothered by it, and hopefully we can talk about it and address it. So if you do engage in the chat, please do so with the ideas. You're welcome to disagree with each other, but do so respectfully. And otherwise, you can raise your hand by going down to the reactions button and click raise hands and engage in the conversation. I look forward to it. James, you're up first.
Roger, you just said politics is the dispelling of prejudices. Yes? This is how what she thinks.
Yes, but not with the idea of getting rid of prejudices or thinking that you're not prejudiced in your effort to dispel prejudice. But yes.
She also talks about freedom. She also talks where, forgive my ignorance, where exactly does she say that?
Where does she say what?
It's the dispelling of prejudices.
Oh, I just read it to you. It's on page, I think 90.
152?
No, it's on 10. Well, she says it in a couple places, but the first place is on 101. Oh, no, I'm sorry. On 99, the bottom. Right?
Okay.
That is why at all times and places, it is the task of politics to shed light upon and dispel prejudices, which is not to say its task is to train people to be unprejudiced.
Right.
Or that those who work towards such enlightenment are themselves free of prejudice.
This reading came midst all these other texts on racism, etc. Correct?
Yes.
I don't. Am I grasping? And I love this text. We've read it before. Am I to grasp a tool in this that's going to help in this essay that's going to help me understand the other things that we've been reading on racism?
Okay, you know, you've done two things there.
Okay, what did I do?
Which is one, take me to task for having forgotten to sort of put the entirety of the meaning of this, why we're reading this today. So I appreciate that.
Okay.
And the other is, well, let's just start there. Why are we reading this text on introduction to politics and on prejudice in a group of essays that we're talking about racism? My answer is, and let me say, this is my reading of Arendt. I don't know anyone else who's ever made this reading of Arendt, which doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It just means you guys can judge. But the argument, as I understand it, or as I'm trying to present it, is that Arendt is telling us something very important in our attempt to think about the question of race, which is that there is a difference, as she says in the Origins, in the chapters we read the last few weeks, between race thinking and racism. As I said, on violence, she's going to say there's a difference between race and racism. What I'm suggesting to you here is that Arendt is telling us there's a difference between prejudice and racism. And that you must be anti-racist, because racism, as we read earlier, is the end of humanity. It is the belief and the conviction that some people are lower than others, and as a result should be killed or enslaved or other things. But prejudice is not the end of humanity. It's part of humanity. To be human is to be prejudiced. And to be prejudiced is to be human. And so
okay,
to the extent that we want to fight racism, we have to be anti-racist, but we can't be anti-prejudice. And, you know, and so if you want to take that and here, I'm making an argument that I think is implicit in Arendt, but is not explicit. And that is that when we encounter prejudice, we should not call it racism. And today, we increasingly call all prejudice racism. And I think it's important to read Arendt on these questions because she shows us the pitfalls of expanding the definition of racism, which she thinks of as an ideological claim of superiority that supports violent or legal oppression, to racism, which is to prejudice, which is simply an opinion.
Can I be racist without being prejudiced?
Can you be, you can certainly be, no, that's a good question. I actually just wrote a couple pages on this. You certainly can be prejudiced without being racist. Now,
yes.
Can you be racist without being prejudiced? Well, this is what I was reading to you on page 152, right?
Yep.
Insofar as racism is the universalization of prejudice. This is a question where it's a little, I could answer this in different ways depending on how I wanted to do it. So I'm just going to try and answer it as concretely as I can. For her, a prejudice is not an ideology. In fact, a prejudice is simply a prejudgment, an unthought judgment.
Yep.
An ideology is a universalist pseudo-theory rationalization of prejudices that have crumbled and no longer seem valid, and yet people are not willing to give up. So can you then say, can you be racist without being prejudiced? Well, racism includes a kind of universalization of prejudice. And in that sense, you could say that you can't be racist without being prejudiced. But you could also say, well, a racist is no longer prejudiced because they now are a pseudo-theorist, not someone who simply takes things on authority. I'm resisting your question because I don't want to make a simple answer. I think her argument is a little more nuanced and complicated than to say simply, if you're racist, you're prejudiced. I think what it is if you're racist, you've responded to the crumbling of prejudices by doubling down on your prejudice and turning it into an ideology. So yes, in a sense, you are prejudiced if you're racist, but in a different way.
Well, at least it keeps us in the arena.
Yeah.
Keeps us in the desert. And
right. But the problem is not the prejudice. The problem is the universalization of the prejudice.
Amen.
Now, that doesn't mean that all prejudices are good, right? And that's why politics is about dispelling prejudices. But it also means that prejudices are not dangerous and inhuman in the way racisms are. And, we'll get into this, but if you really take her seriously, it offers a radically new way of thinking about prejudices and racism in our time, right? Which is that we need to be more careful about distinguishing them and about saying that when we encounter prejudice, A, not calling it racism, B, engaging it seriously in a political way, which means understanding the truth that may have once been in it for that person and trying to get them to encounter us and encounter others in a way that makes them make judgments instead of stay safely in their prejudgments, but doing it in a way that's respectful enough that we don't, in a sense, push them to become ideologues. And that's the, you know, this is of course not a language Arendt would ever have used, but if you wanted to create an anti-racist protocol from Arendt, that would be how I would imagine it. And that's what I've been interested in the last couple of months and years in some of my writing, is trying to develop this idea. You know, and one of the things I'm trying to argue is that this is actually an important idea for us to think about today.
Boy, there's so many opportunities to do that now.
Yeah, and some people may disagree. I mean, and I'm perfectly open to that, and I'm open to hearing those who disagree. But that's the provocation that I'm finding in these writings.
Thank you.
Yep. Jeff.
Good morning. I didn't think I was going to have a question today, so I'm kind of thinking out loud. But it's pretty brief though. I mean, this essay, as you pointed out, is basically like a rough draft of the human condition. We can kind of see which part sort of took over the book. You know, when they come after this. There's 50 pages about the Greeks again, right? Which I love. But I'm starting to warm to people's feeling that maybe, you know, there's too much about the Greeks. So could you imagine that there could have been another version of the human condition that basically centered this idea, which is basically Kantian still, right? That basically that we have to find a way to overcome our prepackaged judgments, namely prejudices, and the way to do that is with the help of other people. We can't really do it ourselves. We have to basically, there is not, you know, one truth that we can sort of uncover. It's that rather we can this is I love this idea from William James, right? Man is the animal that has too many instincts, right? So the way it works is they sort of keep each other in check. It's a balance of power thing, which is totally political, right? That basically, could she have constituted the public realm as the area where thinking can actually happen, where we can pull apart prejudices and then make real judgments again, which then of course will become prejudices, like the one in favor of democracy, in favor of doing that activity is the one thing that we can decide to do without, you know, sort of for all time. But everything else, basically, we have to sort of, you know, take them apart once in a while. But anyway, but the idea is that what I'm asking about is whether the public realm could be considered as defined by this activity of enabling thinking, that we can really only do it in public. That's what occurred to me.
Thanks, Jeff. It's actually a fascinating question for me. You know, I'll say two things. First of all, I don't think she ever gives up on this. In many of her works, she comes back to very similar formulations. So in 3 or 4 essays in the 1960s, she uses a sentence, a formulation that I've come to, I must have mentioned it many times on this call, on our group, where she says, talking about piety and justice makes the world more pious and more just. And I take that to be a continuation of this idea of politics. Now, that idea is not foreign to the human condition. You know, the human condition makes it very clear that speaking and acting in public in ways that can be seen by others and that matter to others and that make you matter are at the heart of human action and thus part of the human condition. Also, I mean, the human condition and the vita activa, depending on, you know, the book, the human condition, or the book, the vita activa, is very much about the threat to politics, right? The prejudice against politics coming from less Plato in that book and more the rise of science and modern science and the idea of of a world that would replace politics with science and thus take away the role of action and the political sphere and replace it with the laboring animal or the anima laborans. So I think there's nothing in her writing here that is inconsistent with the human condition and vice versa. It is, I think, an interesting question, if I take this to be what you're asking, which is, why does this whole discussion of prejudice drop out of the human condition? Maybe that's part of your question. I don't know, but it's certainly something I've asked myself. I don't know if I have a full answer to that. I mean, it could be a strategic, or it could be that she was just more interested in thinking about it. She was framing the question differently in the human condition. She's thinking about the loss of action, and the loss of man as the acting animal. But I don't think it drops out because she changes her opinion or anything, because in many later texts she comes back to these formulations. So I think they can be read together productively as opposed to antagonistically. I guess that's what I would say. Vigdis.
Yes, I was thinking when I read this about language and how we use language and how we make distinction when we experience things. Like when you said, for instance, with race thinking versus racism, as a kind of, we experience differences in the world and we make different words about it. So when meeting people that very different from us, you kind of make distinction between us and them. And this is also what you mentioned, this with sex and gender. And we have he and she, and that was also seen as the people are either male or female. And now you have all the differences. And this distinction comes into kind of prejudices for people. And in one way, as you say, when there come changes in it, then people get kind of disturbed. They don't want this. They want to keep it as it has been. But also that they kind of make a reservoir, or what you can call it, for making ideologies. So I think language and the way we use language to describe the world and the way we make distinction about what we experiences comes in very, very much here. And maybe that could say something about human condition and how she does that, because she's very concerned about distinction there. And how, for instance, between the private and the public and the social coming in, and how we have lost those distinctions, and also between labor, work, and action, which we don't have either. So there's something in this relation between how we make distinction and how the language works, and how this makes us kind of think about prejudices and think about how to make judgment about it. I don't know if I was clear about that, but what's your opinion about this relation?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm reading this essay as an attempt to make a distinction between prejudice and ideology, at least in part. And that the prejudice against politics, right, is one that is a prejudice and that needs to be respected and yet also, in her mind, dispelled. And I'm suggesting that her insight into the distinction and the importance of the distinction between prejudice and ideology is also important in talking about other prejudices in addition to politics, namely anti-Semitism or misogyny or anti-trans or Islamophobia or racism or whatever. And we have increasingly embraced a prejudice that denies that distinction, right? So, I mean, just to give one example of someone who's thought about this, and I think who's someone I have great respect for, but I disagree with on this, is John McWhorter, right? John McWhorter, has written an essay saying racism used to be simply an ideology, and it was difference from prejudice. But today, we don't make a distinction between racism and prejudice, and we no longer should, according to McWhorter. Prejudice is simply an attitude that can lead to discrimination. And that's how we now use racism. And McWhorter's a linguist. And he says, so we should just expand the definition of racism to include prejudice. He then says we shouldn't, however, expand the definition of racism to include unequal outcomes. And here's where he'll disagree with people like Ibram X. Kendi, right? And he'll say, because that takes intention out of it, and racism has to include intention. And so that's McWhorter's argument. I'm suggesting that Arendt would disagree with McWhorter. And I think she would do so for reasons that I think are actually good reasons. Which is that when you expand the definition of racism to include prejudice and thus sort of unconscious bias and things like that, you, in a sense, normalize anti-prejudice as a universal ideology. And anyone who is now has a different prejudice than you is now someone who's a racist and thus to be excluded from polite society or public society. And she sees that expansion of the definition of racism to prejudice to be one that is dangerous and, in its sense, racist, insofar as it takes certain people and for their prejudices says that they're anti-human. And so she's not the only one who says this. And there's a number of, I think, very interesting writers who are trying to hold on to this distinction between racism and prejudice, but they're certainly cutting against the grain today. But I think Arendt does so with more intelligence and insight than anyone. And that's why I think she's worth thinking about along these issues. Wherever you end up on your own opinion on whether she's right or wrong.
Yeah, and isn't there something when she also distinguished between the social and the political? Because in the social, we have to have these prejudices and they have to function in a way. And as she says about anti-Semitism as well, you can't erase anti-Semitism from the social field, but it's different with the political. This is in what you have to erase from the political field.
That's right.
Yeah, I think
we'll talk more about that when we read the letter she wrote to James Baldwin in a couple weeks. That's going to be a big part of our conversation then. But yes. So you're absolutely right. George.
I'll be brief because I was going to speak about, I think the letter was to Ralph Ellison, wasn't it?
She wrote a letter to Ralph Ellison, and she also wrote a letter to
Okay.
James Paul.
But basically, I wanted to go back to the politics of it, the critique that you may not want to talk about it now, but I think we're on the topic. The critique that she's too wedded to the great Greek idea of the polis, where she assumes that all those who can engage effectively in politics have equal social or cultural power. For instance, now, let's say only white people have enough social or cultural power to engage in politics, according to some groups. So that's something that I think is a reasonable critique of her, and I think she responded to that.
So yeah, I mean, there's just two parts to your question, I guess. One is about the Greeks, and one is about who has the power in the political realm. Arendt obviously did read the Greeks quite closely. She also read the Romans quite closely. And I would say she was, in the end, much more influenced by the Romans than she was by the Greeks. But I think the critique that people make about her Greek philia or such things, is, if it's going to have any teeth, it's going to be a critique that she's nostalgic for the Greeks, right? That's what some people say. I certainly don't believe that's the case. Again, I can only tell you that's my reading of her. I think Arendt goes and reads the Greeks. She reads the Romans. She reads the Americans, by the way, a lot. She reads the French, Montesquieu, who's quite influential on her. She reads Machiavelli, who's quite influential on her. And she takes from all of them, and she's a fairly original and unique thinker who is actually writing about the present and the future more than she is about the past. I see no nostalgia in Arendt in her writing. I mean, almost all of her essays and books end with, we need to start something new. We can't go back to the past. We can't go back to the Greeks. We can't go back to the, founding of America. We have to take what was good from them, think it through, understand that we no longer have that, and we need to build something new. That's the whole premise of freedom and spontaneity and natality, which is so part of her writing. I find her to be one of the least nostalgic thinkers I've ever encountered, which doesn't mean she doesn't love and read and profit from the past. Her method, as she describes in the essay on Walter Benjamin, is what she calls pearl diving, or, take from the past what you find valuable, shine it up, and think about how to make it build a new future with it. Every single one of her essays ends with this sort of like, we need to start anew. We need to build new things. We need revolution, right? We need a new foundation. That's not nostalgia. And so I've always found the nostalgic critique of Arendt to just have no teeth. And so it's, I can only say that. I can only respond to it that way. It's never been something I've taken seriously because I just don't see it. I understand that people say, oh, well, she thought we should have public equality like the Greeks, and the Greeks had slavery, and the Greeks didn't let women or children or slaves be part of the citizens. Of course not. But Arendt has no desire to go back to that world. What she does take from the Greeks in that regard, and is that it's unlikely to ever create a society in which the majority of people, most of the time, want to engage in politics. Politics, in the end, is always going to be for those people who love to engage in politics. But what she says at the end of On Revolution is that political elite should not be racial or gendered or economic or hereditary, but it should be from the bottom up of people who actually enjoy politics, talking with strangers, talking to each other, and dispelling prejudices and finding new commonalities. And for people who enjoy that, whatever race or class or, tradition they come from, they should become the political elite. And so she takes from the Greeks that politics needs a space of appearance where people who love to engage in a kind of political activity of thinking and talking with each other, that can't be everybody, but that is there. But she then opens it up to, I think, a radically new future and invention. Okay. I don't know if are you talking, George? I can't hear you, but
I understand what you're saying, but still going back, let's say, as a German citizen at one time, she felt that she was could be engaged actively in politics, even though she was a little bit of a pariah. Once the Nazis came to power, only Aryans could be engaging in politics. So it's really, there may be some nostalgia for that type of a thing, or you think not at all?
I don't think I understood what you meant, because she certainly has no nostalgia for the Nazis.
No, but she had nostalgia for a time, or a time where she thought that she could engage.
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's nostalgia. She believes that everybody should have the right to engage in politics.
Yeah.
Not everyone will. I mean, most people would rather, watch Netflix or listen to music or take a walk with their kids than engage in politics.
Yeah, but if they had the power, if they had the will to engage in politics, they could. And that doesn't happen in this country or any other country that I know of.
I'm sorry, I something happened in the background. Can you repeat your point?
Yeah, but if they had the will to engage in politics, they would be able to. But this doesn't happen in any country that I'm aware of.
Okay, well, she thinks obviously it should, and she thinks that if you read her book on revolution, that's what it's about, is that obviously it's never happened fully, but she thinks that that's the essence of what she would call small r Republican government, which she thinks is the founding ethos of the United States of America, even though if it's clearly never been a reality. And it's a complicated book, and she has a devastating critique of America on that regard, but also holds it up as a possibility that can be striven for. So yeah, I mean, that's not a nostalgia for the Greeks. I mean, because the Greeks never had that either. So I'll leave it at there.
Thank
Shot.
you.
Hi, the question I had was, can you hear me?
Yes.
The question I had was regarding your comment on all the EDI work currently in America. When I read that part, it's kind of confusing to me. The part that you emphasize on page 99 about we should shed light upon and dispel prejudice. I feel like those are the essence of EDI work that people do, try to make people aware about their biases, but not necessarily tell them what they should. Do they tell them how that has been my experience? Not that I wholeheartedly believe in any of that, because I kind of understand what she's talking about, although I don't know what's the exact solution for it. So I wanted you to say more about what you think. Do you think just like the EDIs are just like totally like useless, and we need to leave people to follow their prejudice, just leave with their prejudices, or and like the thing is, a lot of it is in misogyny, related to the misogyny in the working world, that I don't know if we don't have those kind of equity conversations, equity, inclusion, and all that conversations, if the male dominant environments will be aware of the common, you know, the common practices that are just like a status quo and like basically the usual practice. Thanks.
Thanks, Shadi. So, first of all, I like to think of myself as someone who knows something about Hannah Arendt. I don't know how much I know about DEI and EDI. So, I've read about them. I participated in them, and I don't consider myself a pure-on expert on them in any way, shape, or form. So, let me answer your question with that caveat. Insofar as these workshops or these ideas are about bringing people together and talk to learn from each other, right? I think they can be very valuable, right? I mean, back when I was younger, and that's a long time ago at this point, we used to have these consciousness raising groups where we would go and talk to people and break into groups of different religions and races and genders and do this, and they were very powerful. And I think I certainly would never begrudge that. I think those are very powerful and can be transformative for people in the way that I think Arendt talks about. They're political in that sense. I think to the extent that I was offering a maybe veiled critique of the DEI industry today, and maybe in a somewhat glib way, and I recognize that, I was talking more about the way in which these workshops now are imposed on people, not something you go to voluntarily like I did when I was, a young person engaged in these. And the premise of them, at least, again, I'm sure there's better and worse ones, seems to be, there are people who are wrong and there are people who are right. Now, again, there maybe my prejudice against them is wrong, and that's not the way they're taught. That there are people who are privileged and there's people without privilege, and there's people with power and there's people without power. And part of it is coming to, admit that, and come to see and admit and apologize and whatever for your power or not power. And all of the social science evidence that I have read shows that these DEI workshops don't work very well. In fact, much of it shows that they're quite counterproductive. And the explanations that people have given is that the people who, come into these are often feel like they're attacked and feel like they're, basically being told that they're prejudiced or this or that. And all I'm saying is, from an Arendtian perspective, we have to realize that the DEI perspective, to the extent it is one of get rid of prejudices and get rid of privilege, is a prejudice. And it's one that, is one of the many, and I'll use a word here that maybe I should or should not use, legitimate prejudices in society. And so I think the challenge, I'm not saying get rid of the effort to have these conversations. In fact, I think the argument I've made is we should have these conversations, but I think they shouldn't be had with the idea of we are the experts who are coming in here to teach you how to believe. And maybe, again, maybe that's not how the experts act, but it certainly seems to me from my limited experience of DEI workshops that I've had to sit through is that has been the attitude. And I know that that's widely considered to be the attitude by many of the social scientists and others who've looked at them. If that's wrong, and if there are people doing it in a much more organic and better way, I think that's great. And I would support that. I don't know if that helps or not.
Yes, yes. The ones that I have been to are
Shadi, you froze, or I think you froze. All right, I'm going to move on to Bruce because Shadi froze for a while. Bruce?
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to try to connect the discussion of prejudgments and judgment and learning through participation and action and speech to another thing that really struck me that was said in the introduction into politics. And it had to do with the, and I don't know the page number exactly where this occurs, but at one point, I think that she says, the important thing here with action is freedom, and freedom takes place in the in-betweens between the plurality of difference of whatever experience, background, race, belief that we have. There's a co-creation of a world in between the plural people, and that is very important. As a matter of fact, when I read it, I got the impression that it was the action of co-creation as much as the action of speech about beliefs and facts and values and prejudices and so forth. The co-creative act seemed very important. And
yeah.
So that leads me to think maybe we need to talk about prejudgment and the transformation, the critical examination, and hence the civic learning that can come out of, sort of making judgments about existing prejudgments. And it's not primarily or a psychological thing about changing people.
That's right.
It's about the world that we create between us.
Bruce, that's a very important point, and thanks for highlighting it. And what I want to, and that actually goes somewhat to Shadi's question as well. Arendt, later on in the essay, talks about how it is a mistake to think about addressing prejudice by trying to change people to be anti-prejudice. Right? You can't think about this as changing man and changing people's opinions. Because, and this goes to what I was trying to say with Shadi, right? To the extent these workshops happen and we have to say, there are people here who are prejudiced and there are people who are less prejudiced. No, we all have our prejudices. And if you come in and say, you have to change your prejudices to be more like mine, it's about changing people. And Arendt thinks that's dangerous and impossible. What she thinks needs to happen, and Bruce, you brought up, your language is exactly right, is in talking to each other amidst our different prejudices, we need to find new common languages and new common ideas that will create new shared worlds. And I said in the introduction, in my introductory remarks, new prejudices. Because you can't have a world without prejudices. You can't have a world without things people share. So I think you're absolutely right. The kind of political discussion, political talking that Arendt is talking about is one in which we build we have the freedom in talking to build new public institutions and new public ideas and even new prejudices. So I think that was a really important point, and thank you for bringing it up. Did I get it right, Bruce, what you were saying? And
Oh, yes, absolutely. And again, I think there's more of this string to play out. My experience of reading Arendt is that she has a tendency to say the essence or the activity of politics is X, and then immediately to say, but that doesn't mean we can get rid of X.
Yeah.
So,
that's right. That's right. Good. Thank you. Who is this? Ward or no?
Hi, I'm Gilda Warden. Hi, sorry.
Hi, Gilda.
Thanks very much, Roger. So what's curious to me about our discussion with Arendt's position that we do need more prejudice. Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, it's not that we need more, it's that we can't get rid of prejudice, and we have to instead, we have to normalize prejudice and yet understand that part of politics is constantly dispelling and reimagining prejudice.
Okay, so here's where I get just a little bit feisty, because we're talking from what's considered the normative perspective, that we're going to all sit around and talk or converse about this. And Arendt comes out of the era of the Nazis. She comes out of the Germans and the influence of Lutheranism, with Luther being an anti-Semite himself. So with that worldview, for us to these days talk about or discuss how we're going to do this, we have to somehow humble ourselves, sit back, and let those that have not had a normative worldview present in such a way to give them some sense of normative. Do you see what I'm saying?
Voice, you mean?
Sorry?
Voice?
Yes, but it has to become somehow normative. You know, anybody who is not German white, and forgive me, German white is not considered the norm, right? This is what we're struggling against. So if you are not Lutheran, if you're not blue-eyed blonde, you know, all those things, you're not considered normative in the discussion. You're considered a victim of prejudice by the norm. So the voice of those who are not considered normative somehow has to become normative. Does that make sense at all?
Well, I mean, I hear two steps to your argument. One is that in any political sphere, and someone else was asking this about power before, right? There's going to be people who are more powerful and people who are less powerful, people who are who represent the norm, and those who represent not the norm. And that's true. The second step is, okay, we need to make sure that the public sphere is one of what Arendt calls relative equality, where everyone can have voice and be seen and act in public in the way they speak and act in public in ways that matter. That I think is very true and is certainly consonant with Arendt. I hear a third step in your argument, which is that we have to then, in a sense, to make up for maybe past injustices, take the people who were not the norms, but the minority, and make them the norm. And in a sense, give them the power and exclude other people. That's certainly not Arendt's view.
Well, no, I don't know that we should be excluding anybody, right? I mean, is it
You said
possible
make
to have-
them normative, so I take that to be,
Okay, so is it possible to have more than one normative?
well, that's called plurality, and that's called, that's her vision of politics,
Yes.
yes.
Yes, the struggle is with all of our ways of differentiating each other in the public sphere, how are we going to do it? We have that inherent bias, that inherent prejudice.
Yeah.
What is relative equality? And what does that mean? Relative to what?
Well,
See,
that's a great question, Gilda. I mean, and that's the question of how to create a politics. And Arendt writes a lot about that. She thinks you need multiple institutions, you need local institutions, you need what she calls ward systems or town halls. And you need many ways to give as many people a voice, including, by the way, civil disobedience and protest. So yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of ways to create a constitutional system that allows alternate non-normative voices into it. And Arendt is certainly one of the political thinkers most interested in developing those institutional frameworks. Let me just get Ken to ask his question quickly because we only have a minute left and I have to go. So Ken?
Well, we're kind of getting there. I just wanted to talk about the end of the essay, which it seems like she turns the whole thing on its head. Because mostly we're talking about politics in terms of force and brute force and like one person over the other. And every time I hear the word prejudice, I cringe a little bit. But she's using it in a way of prejudgment as equals coming together, which is, I think, what Gilda was bringing up also, that she wants us to think of politics as the keeping of peace. And that has to do with equality and then making the world as rich as possible. And how we get to that equality is, I think Gilda's question is great. Like how we get there is really difficult. But I think in the end, she's proposing that we think of that plurality as a way of making peace. And she says not even that we can do it, but we must do it because war in an old sense means annihilation.
I mean, peace is a complicated word. I mean, she's not in favor of war generally, although there are times when you might need it. And she's not in favor of violence, but there are times when you may need it. But she definitely thinks that politics should be about persuasion, right? Word we haven't used much today. But by persuasion, and Linda Zarelli just gave a great talk on this at the Arendt Center 2 weeks ago. She doesn't mean that I persuade you to my point of view. By persuasion, and this is what I think Linda Zarelli did such a good job of bringing out, is by persuasion, she means for you and I to sit down and talk to each other and something divine to come out of it, which is a new agreement that in which I give some way and you give some way. And that's what I call, talking together in public about piety and justice and a new world coming out, a new common world. And so that's that focus on persuasion as opposed to force is, in that sense, yes, is very much the core of her idea of politics. But it's a persuasion in which we both admit that we're prejudiced and we don't put one prejudice and say it's true and the other untrue. That's the argument. Unfortunately, I have to go. I have a commitment I have to run to, but this was great. If you came on late, let me remind you, I'm going to change the schedule because next week I'm going to be traveling. We will meet in 2 weeks to discuss Arendt's reflections on Little Rock, one of her, I think, most fascinating, but also most controversial essays. So come ready to read it in 2 weeks, whatever day that is. And we will see you then. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thanks very much.